are some good jokes? What? Oh, we're good? All right. Hallelujah. Yeah, I'm not telling jokes. We will go ahead and begin. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to all the people who stayed home to watch on TV, apparently. We did get it up, so if you asked me if we had a live stream, which a lot of people did today, and I said, I don't know, it was an honest answer, okay? I don't know unless he shows up to do the live stream. And so there is a live stream, apparently. So we're going to go ahead and begin. Basic outline tonight. I'm going to talk for hopefully just 1 hour is my goal, okay? This is a lot of material to try to wean through and decide what I should talk about when I only have one presentation to give. And then if we have any discussion or questions, I'm happy to take questions at the end. And then if there are no questions in the room, or when the questions in the room are done, we will, what are we streaming on? Facebook and YouTube. So we'll at least check those for comments. So if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can comment along the way. That actually saves us a lot of time, because then we can just watch and write them down as we go. But I will try to get to those questions depending on how many questions are in the room. But the people in the room who actually drove here will have priority on asking questions if you'd like. So the topic tonight is going to be biblical creation versus evolution. This was actually the first topic I ever got into in the world of apologetics. So apologetics, just the defense of the Christian faith. There's a lot that falls under apologetics. And so you kind of have to pick somewhere to start, or it becomes overwhelming. Are you trying to deal with all the different world religions? Are you trying to deal with all the philosophical objections, all the historical debates? What are you really dealing with? Are you dealing with theology? So the topic I picked at first was the creation evolution topic, and I probably spent about 5 years on this topic before I then went into other topics to try to get a good grasp on this topic. So this is my favorite topic, actually, to talk about and to engage on. And so what I've done is I tried to condense a portion of a very long class into one night. And so if you feel like I'm rushing, I am rushing. My goal tonight is not for you to regurgitate the information I am going to share with you. My goal is to imprint an overall impression that the biblical model of creation is true and superior to a secular model of evolution. If anybody at the end of this would like the PowerPoint, I'll send you the PowerPoint. You don't have to freak out and try to take notes the whole time. Some slides I'll be on for 10 seconds, and some I'll be on for up to 50 seconds, actually. There's a lot of slides, so we got to get going. Biblical creation versus evolution. Really, when I approach this topic, if I'm debating someone, usually on the street at that point, if I'm debating someone, really kind of the premise that I set up with this topic is not, can either side shoot a hole in the other side's theory? That's possible on all sides. To find some little problem or something that's not yet explained, you can always find something in a large-scale scientific explanation of the origins of the universe. You can always find something that's not answered. Really, my question and how I think we should analyze this is, which theory explains the information we have in the most comprehensive way? Which one makes sense of the most? When we have the world around us and we have so many different scientific studies and so much information on the nature of the universe, the nature of planet Earth, when we have so much information, which one best explains the most of what we see today? So the way we're going to do this, because I had to just narrow it down and pick kind of a subcategory. We're going to go through the days of creation and look at some of the scientific evidence for what the Bible says about creation. And along the way, I will also shoot some rounds at the other side. Okay? So my primary objective is to build in your mind a solid foundation that biblical creation does explain things that we see in the world and actually predicts much of what we see in the world, and that the evolutionary naturalistic theory of origins does not. And so Genesis 1 is going to be where we spend most of our time this evening. There's this broad statement that God created everything in 6 days, and then you can go through the different days of creation and you can see what is created on each of those 6 days. Now, I'm not going to go over that all right now because we're going to do that throughout the evening. So we're going to start with the first day of creation and see what the Bible says. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Probably the most known verse in Scripture, certainly the one that is easiest to quote. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Really what we have here is this idea that at some point in the past there's a start, there's a starting point for three things: time, space, and matter. In the beginning, that would be time. God created the heavens, that would be space, and the earth, that would be matter. And we have to understand this is being written down by Moses, and so that means we're around 3,700 years ago when this is being written, and that is not what the predominant thought at any point until about 100 years ago was. The idea that the universe had a starting point, the idea that everything has not always existed. If you go back into the ancient world, most people thought that the universe, in some sense, has always been here, as far as Greek thought that matter is just eternal, and the Bible right up front said that's not the case. We know that's not the case now, and this part is fairly undisputed. Even the secular side has to admit, okay, well, the universe hasn't always been here. The universe hasn't always been here. And so now that they've admitted the universe hasn't always been here, we get to something called the cosmological argument for God's existence. And I think this is something very helpful for you to learn. It's very easy. It's a basic syllogism, which is just premise, conclusion. And this is deductive reasoning, which means if the premises are true, the conclusion naturally follows. It must follow. So the cosmological argument goes like this: anything that begins to exist has a cause. And so for a long time, there was a debate on whether or not the universe, all of creation, whether or not the universe actually began at some point, or if it just eternally existed inside time. And so it became fairly undisputed, even in the atheist world, that the universe has a starting point. The universe has a starting point. They would tend to call it the Big Bang is when they have their starting point, but the universe has a starting point. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, all right? That's undebated, which would mean that the universe needs a cause for its existence. It would need a reason for being here. And this has become a struggle for atheism. When you try to figure out how without God do you get a universe, it turns out that your answers are not the most intelligent sounding answers. Especially when you're going to mock someone who believes God is the answer, when your answer is quite literally there's no cause and then it happens. And so when we look at the Bible accurately states that there is a God, there is a creator who did make time, space, and matter at some point in the past, because the universe has not always been here. And the idea that the universe can come about from nothingness, I could spend the whole evening on this topic. The problem is every 4 slides is an entire presentation condensed. And so really, if anybody says, well, the universe came about from nothing, simply ask them what properties of nothing were able to produce the universe. All right? And if they can tell you what property of nothing, it's not nothing, because nothing doesn't have properties. Okay? Verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The Bible has these repeated statements about creation and water specifically. Water keeps coming up. In verse 6, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. Initially, everything that is there is identified as being water. You go to the New Testament and other places in the Old Testament and Psalms. You go to 2 Peter 3:5, though. It says, for they deliberately, this is the scoffers and the unbelievers, they deliberately overlook this fact, that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God. you just have repeated statements that God creates out of water, that everything begins as water. The Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the water. There's a separation of water from water. I'll talk about that in a moment. God creates through and by water. And so there's this brilliant physicist, he's still alive today, named Dr. Russell Humphreys. He's a physicist who decided to study planetary magnetic fields. So you're all familiar with a magnet, I hope, all right? And if you're not, buckle up. Magnetic fields, different planets have magnetic fields, and not just planets, but planets have magnetic fields, some of them. And it's the reason your compass points north for the most part. Geographic north and magnetic north are a little bit off, but it's generally the same direction. And so we have a big electrical generator inside the outer core of the Earth that generates a magnetic field on planet Earth. It's very good we have a magnetic field. If we didn't have a magnetic field, people would get a lot sicker a lot faster and have a lot more cancer because it blocks an enormous amount of solar radiation. And so you can look at planets, moons, and stars, and many of them have these magnetic fields. So Russell Humphreys developed a theory. And when you look at the Bible statements, everything's created by water and through water. If you had asked me this, 15 years ago, is there any way you could even prove that? I would say, no. I mean, it happened and then it's done, so how would we possibly prove it? Humphreys wasn't content with that answer, so here's what he did. Humphreys takes the statements about everything being created from water and transformed into other elements. And he says, let's apply this to predictions of planetary magnetic strength. And he developed what's called the rapid decay theory. So he says God created everything originally as water. You don't have to agree with him yet, but just wait till the conclusion of what he's able to do with this theory. God created everything originally as water. God then transforms the water into other elements, and then the planet, as it exists today, like planet Earth, obviously it's other elements primarily now, the field in that object then begins to decay, and the rate of decay is going to be based just on the material that the magnet exists in and how well it's conductive to that magnetism. And so he said that's the basic formula. Now, he wrote a whole book with all the equations, and you can go get that if you want to get that. We're not going to go through them all. Humphreys then has to pick a timeline, because what Humphreys is going to end up doing is he's going to end up publishing back in the late 80s, if memory serves, sometime in the 80s. He's going to start publishing predictions on the planetary magnetic strength of planets that we have not measured yet. We've measured Earth by this time, but he's going to start publishing predictions on planets we have yet to fly past at that point. And so what he has to do is he has to say, okay, if everything starts as water and you align the hydrogen in the water, it generates a magnetic field for a moment. God then converts out of water into another material, and the part of that material that can hold the magnetic charge is then going to hold it, and it's going to die over time, okay? Now, in order to predict where will it be today, you have to assume one more factor. You have to assume the age of the thing. Does that make sense? You can't say it started with 10, today it'll be 2, unless you know, okay, if it's losing 1 every 500 years, where does that put it today? So in order to make a prediction, he takes the young Earth perspective, and he says, let's just assume that these objects in our solar system specifically, Humphreys actually thinks the objects far out in the universe are probably millions and billions of years old. He thinks our solar system's young. We don't have time for that unless you bring it up in Q&A. And so he says, let's assume Earth and our solar system are 6,000 years old. They start as water, they convert, and then the magnetic energy dies. So you just take the mass of the planet, convert that to water, convert that to the magnetic strength. If you align hydrogen, cool. Here's what he's able to do. We then flew past Uranus and Neptune. His model, which is the rapid decay theory, published before we flew by them, In addition to his model, the secular model, the dynamo theory, also made their publications on the magnetic strength of Uranus specifically. The planets are very similar, so it was assumed they would have similar magnetic fields. So the real question is, what is Uranus's magnetic field? And so the difference between their prediction is 100,000 times different. And we fly by, and Humphreys is exactly correct on his prediction of the magnetic strength of both those planets, just under the assumption, biblical time frame, it starts as water. And then Humphreys starts to make more predictions, and I think it was 2014, we went to Mercury. Humphreys accurately predicted the magnetic strength of Mercury. We got the first reading after his prediction was made. He then started saying other things. He said, Mars used to have a magnetic field. It's now died. So when we land a probe on Mars, they're going to detect a crustal magnetic field from the remnants of magnetism, but it's not going to have a full planetary magnetic field. The dynamo theory said it never had a magnetic field. It's not big enough. We land crustal magnetic field. It used to have a magnetic field. He said the same thing for the moon. And he said the moon had a magnetic field at one point in the past too. You'll find crustal magnetism. The dynamo theory said, no way, it's not big enough. We land, we have crustal magnetism. He's managed to predict every object in the solar system correctly under this model. And the model is very simple. Things start as water. That's the core of the model. And I think it's fascinating. You're not going to really hear about this in school, unfortunately. I think it's fascinating that you just take such a simple statement like things start as water, and he thought of a way, how do we put this to the test and figure out, do things start as water? Because the secular model is absolutely opposite. It says everything starts as molten lava. You don't get much different from water than molten lava. This is far to the other end of the spectrum as you're able to go. And so they think everything starts as molten lava. There's a lot of problems with the naturalist theory on how Earth can form. They have this idea called planetary accretion, which basically means, and I think you should go try this in your backyard. What happens is like a bunch of rocks and asteroids and dust just start clumping together and start like hitting each other and combining in order to make a planet. Please film when you do this and send it to me. If you can start smashing rocks together and get them to stay together. Because what I found is whenever my kids throw rocks at things, they don't stick to them. They tend to break. So that's a oversimplification, I understand. But the core problem is, do they really like just clump together? Is that really what happens when you smash things going tens of thousands of miles in space? Do they really just like stick and build a planet? So that's the first problem with the kind of evolutionary mindset. And then obviously their model really struggles to predict planetary magnetism. Now when you're dealing with a scientific model, it's one thing to be able to match known data, right? So we have measurements on some objects. It's one thing to be able to take your theory and say, all right, how do we mold this to fit the information? It's not wrong to do that, but it's a whole nother thing, and it's considered like real proof of a theory being accurate when you take your model and you say, not how do I mold it to existing information, but now how do I predict unknown information? If my model's true, what should we find, not what do we find? And if you can predict what we should find, what will be the case before we even know, there seems to be something to that model, and that's what the secular model doesn't seem to be able to do. The second day of creation, Genesis 1, 6 through 8, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So we have an expanse in the midst of the waters. So we're still in water territory. We have no reference to land until the third day, and we'll get there. When it talks about this expanse, it says that there is water above the expanse and water below the expanse. The more like common, starting in the 70s probably, view of this interpretation in creation circles was that the earth had some sort of canopy over the earth, whether it be liquid, although it's near impossible to actually sustain and suspend a liquid canopy. It could be ice but the moment anything hits it, it's going to shatter it to pieces. And even if you have a little bit of a gravitational fluctuation, it's just kind of hard to imagine it could be ice, but that's possible maybe, especially if it's like a bunch of ice particles. But then the question is, where did it go? Why isn't it still there? And then the other one is water vapor. So essentially you just have like this thick cloud layer at one point in the upper atmosphere. For the most part, the more science-driven organizations have moved away from the idea of an atmospheric canopy. And it's not really because it's hard to figure out scientifically. It's because the actual biblical argument is stronger that we're not talking about an atmospheric canopy. We're actually talking about like a cosmological scale here. And the reason why that seems to be the case is because the stars go into the expanse. And so there's water below the expanse and water above the expanse, and in the expanse goes stars. It seems like we're dealing with more than just the atmosphere at this point for what the expanse represents. So this is the picture, not to scale by any stretch of the imagination. Just think water below, water above, expanse in the middle. Okay? Y'all with me? This is going somewhere. Okay? So God called the expanse heaven. The stars go into the expanse, and so that's why we think it's probably space that's being talked about here. So it may surprise you, again, not to scale, it may surprise you how much can fit in a small space. Okay, something's going to happen to the expanse in a moment, but it seems to say that there's the water below the expanse, and that water is going to turn into earth on day 3. And then there's water above the expanse, more on that later, and then the stars are put in that expanse. There's a lot of stars, The average galaxy has 100 billion stars, something around that. And then there are an estimated 100+ billion galaxies. And so that number is big and has a word, but I'm not entirely sure which word it is. But I think it's septillion would be the correct word for that. The point is there's a lot of stars out there. But you know what there's even more of than stars? Empty space in space. Anyone know the closest star? Nobody? Really? Okay. Alpha Centauri, well, yeah, the sun, thank you. There's always that person. You are right, just not in the biblical sense, because in the biblical sense it calls it the greater light. Yeah, I had to think of a comeback there. The closest star, besides the sun, is the Alpha Centauri system. Proxima Centauri, I think, is actually closer, but they tend to say Alpha Centauri in books. Anyways, that's 4.5 light years away, okay? Diameter of space is 84, don't quote that exactly, 80-some billion light years is the diameter of space, okay? Billion, got it. The nearest star, 4.5, okay? Small number, okay? My bank account, Elon Musk's bank account, very different. 4.5 light years away, closest star. You know what fits? If you take that as a radius, so you go Earth to the nearest star, and go like that, all that room there, you fit everything in the universe and none of it's touching. Every star in the universe, 0 things touching, all fit within the 4.5 light year radius. Currently, it's spread over 80 billion light years. There's a lot of empty space in space. A lot of stuff actually would fit in a more condensed area. I'm not saying that was the size of the area. I'm just saying you can definitely bring it closer. And you know who else agrees you can bring everything closer? The Big Bang Theory agrees with that because everything literally starts here and then goes out. And so the Bible would suggest, and I'll tell you why this is the suggestion, that we have this expanse, the stars go into the expanse, there's water above the expanse, which is interesting because there's different verses like Psalm 148, 3-4. It says, praise him, sun, moon, praise him, all you shining stars, praise him, you highest heavens, and you waters above the heavens. Like, what a weird reference. You waters above the heavens. as if there is water out there somewhere. You know what's even more interesting? I can't prove this, but I think there's like some inference that can be made. The Bible talks about really three heavens, like three levels to heaven, and it's not the Mormon terrestrial, telestial, celestial. It is the atmosphere, outer space, and then where God dwells, the highest heaven, okay? And so the idea here is you have this expanse, earth at the center, stars go in the expanse, water above the expanse. In a moment, the universe is going to get stretched out, which the Bible predicts. And it tells us, you know, there's these waters above the heavens, right? Above the atmosphere and space, there are these waters. And then it tells us God sits on many waters. There's so many weird references to water and God seated on waters. And so there's some interesting ideas. I don't know what you do with them, but there's some interesting ideas. The Bible then says God stretched out the heavens. And I think this happens on day 4 of creation. We're on day 2, but it's relevant to the expanse. The Bible then says 10 plus times that God stretched out the heavens. Isaiah 40:22, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. There's I think it's 12. References to heaven being stretched out, the heavens being stretched out. And so even though the expanse starts smaller, God eventually stretches it out, I think, on day 4. And then in the 20th century, science actually caught up to this and figured out the universe has or is being expanded. This has taken place. And that's actually what changes the secular model to the Big Bang model, because now they need to account for the stretching out in a naturalistic theory. The Bible said thousands of years ago that the heavens were actually stretched out, and it just took 2,700 years, if we're going by Isaiah, for you know, the general scientific community to catch up to what was already said. The evidence for the stretching, and I'm not going to go into much detail because this is really not a disputed point, but it comes from something called redshift. So anybody familiar with the Doppler effect? So like if you're at a train track, we'll go with the sound version of it, don't be on the train track, right? You want to scoot back for the train to go by. When the train is coming towards you, the pitch of the train's noise is up, okay, because sound waves are being condensed, and shorter sound waves equal higher pitch. And then when it goes by you, right, it goes, because now it's moving away, so sound waves are stretching, which means lower pitch. So that's sound, but the same thing basically happens to light. So light waves, okay, the wavelength of light, if you stretch out a light source, it appears red-shifted, because red is longer wavelengths. And if you condense it, it's blue shift, because blue is the shorter wavelength of light. Here's the point. You look out in the universe from planet Earth, and with 2 exceptions maybe, everything is redshift, okay? Everything is redshift, which means everything is getting farther away from us. And the dominant idea that I would tend to agree with is that space itself is stretching between us and what is distant, and that is why everything is redshift, moving away, because space itself is getting stretched. That would be similar to the secular model. Little different geometry for the universe, but it's the same concept, that space itself is stretching out. Here's where it gets interesting. Space itself is moving apart, going in every direction, okay, right? Because if everything's stretching out, everything is getting farther away from us. Cool. If everything from your vantage point is moving outwards, where must you be? Center, yeah. If everything's moving away from you, and I don't mean center like Earth specifically, but like our solar system's got to be somewhere near the center for everything to move away, Our galaxy's got it. There's 100 billion plus galaxies. Our galaxy has to be like right at center for everything to move away from us. There's only one vantage point where that's how you see things. And so when the Bible says that the water below the expanse is in the midst of the expanse, that would be the Hebrew way of saying center of the expanse. And so you actually have a strong biblical case that it says we're in the center of the expanse and the expanse is space. And we now, it was like 1940s, 50s when we figured out that was actually the case. We said Isaiah 40:22. It also says the earth is a circle, by the way, which is another truth that the Bible promoted a very, very, very long time ago. And somehow this got resurrected recently. Somehow this got resurrected in the last, 20 years. This idea that the earth is not a globe and that it is actually flat. If you believe the earth is flat, we can have this difference, but I'm going to tell you why I think the Bible makes it clear it's not, okay? Many of the statements on creation don't work with a flat earth, plus many Bible verses and then many other discoveries that we'll talk about really fast. How does everything start as water on a flat earth? Because how do you flatten water on nothing? Because in most flat earth models, and I'm not a flat earth expert, but I am familiar with the more popular models of a pillar dome system with Antarctica around, and did I do that right? Yes. And then North Pole in the center. Yeah, I did that right. That's one of the more popular models. Anyways, it says everything is water originally. And I'm just confused, like what holds it? Or where does it go? Why doesn't everything just like fall apart? How do you have everything as water originally if it's not suspended in space with gravity holding it together? That's what I don't get. In a normal model, in the normal model of cosmology, where gravity represents the center of mass, you can actually pull everything into a circle of water. You can't do that on a flat surface if you don't have that type of setting in space. How does the expanse where the stars are get stretched out? Because in most of the flat Earth models, the expanse and then the waters above the expanse, the dome is hard, but the stars in flat earth models are, if you're like, I don't have a clue what you're talking about, that's okay, don't worry about it. This is for a select few who requested this. There's usually a hard dome, and then the celestial bodies are in the dome, which is weird because it says they're in the expanse, and then it says the expanse stretches, so how do you stretch the dome in that way if it's a solid dome? So I'm not sure how that works. And then the Bible has a lot of repeated statements. He stretched out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing. How does that work? It works with space. There's nothing that holds Earth. It's its own gravity towards center mass that holds it. It makes sense in kind of our modern understanding. But how does that work with a flat Earth? Proverbs 8:27. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, right back to water being in a circle, which again only works with our modern understanding. Job 26:10. If you want more information, this is actually one of the stronger arguments. I don't have time to delve into it entirely. This would be a whole presentation in itself. But you can look up an article on Bible Science Institute by Dr. Jason Lisle. He has a whole article on this particular point. But in Job 26:10, he says, he has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. And we call that, so this is the point where day and night meet. It's called the terminator is what we call it. It's the point where it's light on one side and dark on another side. But again, the issue is it's a circle on the water. And if everything's flat, you don't circle water. Water would have to be flat and equal elevation unless it's a center mass of gravity pulling everything in, allowing for curvature on the surface. And so it only works, and again, he has an article that does like 20 pages explaining that one. Here's a theological implication. Psalm 103:12. This is just an interesting fact. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. Do you know how far in a globe east is from west? Infinitely far apart. Yeah, they don't meet. East and west don't meet. North and south meet. North and south, you go 26,000 miles, and now you're the other way. East and west, you can go east forever, and it never becomes west. However, in a flat earth model, this doesn't work. They're all equal. East, west, north, south, all have very defined boundaries when they end, and you would now be going the other way. And I'm not trying to read too much into what is a theological statement, but I don't think it's an accident that God used east-west versus north and south. One means your sin is infinitely taken away from you, and one means it's 26,000 miles away. And in the grand scale of 80 billion light years, 26,000 miles doesn't seem that far. Seems like maybe your sin catch up to you at that point, right? The whole point is it can't. And if the earth is flat, that statement doesn't make sense. Now it has a specific distance, and that distance is roughly 26,000 miles. Evidence outside the Bible clearly shows the earth is round, confirming what I think the Bible has stated for thousands of years. Eratosthenes, he had an experiment. This is one of the most convincing points to me. Some people aren't impressed by this. What he did 2,200 years ago, long before NASA and long before all the international space agencies of the world had time to create a conspiracy about this, what he did is he just looked at the angle of the sun and the shadow casted in two different locations, a few hundred miles apart, and just at the same time of the year, and just by measuring that, he concluded that the earth was what would equate to about 25,500 miles around as a sphere. It's 26. Extremely close by just watching two shadows. And so this theory is not new. The idea of the earth being a globe is not new. This is something the ancients believed. This is something that was calculated long before any conspiracy by NASA could come about in order to try to convince you otherwise. Other evidence is, I think there's literally pictures from space. And your option is there's about 2 to 3 million people in on a mass conspiracy, or the earth is round. Those are the options. Because we get pictures all the time. And at one point, maybe it was easy to say, well, there are no satellites. But man, who has seen Starlink float across the sky, right? You just see this band of satellites float across the sky. And I've had multiple people text me before saying, I think I'm seeing a UFO. A lot of them, I'm like, are they in a straight line? There's probably like 10 to 20 of them. They're like, yeah. And then I sent them a video of Starlink, and they're like, oh yeah, it's Starlink. Which I feel like I crushed their dreams and also saved them at the same time. Because some people are like, whew, I was worried. And then some people are like, well, that makes me feel better. So, but I wish there were aliens. I have gotten that response. Anyways, watching ships go out to sea, this is an easy way to tell that the earth isn't flat. If the earth is flat, the water's flat, which means if you have binoculars or a telescope, you ought to be able to see that thing as far as you can magnify the distance of those things. But that's not how it works. You start to see only the top of the ship after a certain amount of time because there's curvature to the earth. Same deal here. Why is it that the farther away windmills, you see less of them? And there's a picture. Anyways, the earth is round. That was my point. You can challenge me in Q&A if you want. Third day of creation. Dry land is created. Now, we already discussed this in part because that's tied to the magnetic field predictions of material being made out of water. But there are really two other things that are in the third day of creation that I think are interesting. It tells us the waters are gathered in one place in Genesis 1, 9 through 13. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters were gathered together he called seas. So you have this statement that the water is gathered in one place. which is not the case today. There are 4, at least, major oceans today. The water is divided by the land. In order for the water to be in one place, you actually need to isolate the continents then in one place. And if you think this is part of evolutionary theory, you're confused on the history of the supercontinent theory. This is not part of evolutionary theory. I mean, they've had to adapt it because the evidence says it happened, but this did not come up as part of evolutionary theory. The Bible also tells this command to Adam and Eve and their descendants, right? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Really strange if you can't actually get everywhere because there's oceans between you and the rest of the world. It seems like they're created to inhabit the world. And so those are 2 reasons why. In 1859, there is a creationist, Antonio Snyder, who thinks of the supercontinent theory. It's proposed by a biblical creationist because of the verses in Genesis chapter 1. That's where it comes from. And then they found a bunch of evidence to support the supercontinent theory, which I'm not going to go into all the details, but there's a lot of evidence, similar fossils, similar layers, similar depositions, there's a lot of different, and they actually do fit together. If you were to just reverse the plate motions that are going on right now, they would go back together into a supercontinent. That theory's created out of a prediction based on day 3 of creation. And it's created by a geologist who was a creationist. God then creates the biosphere on day 3, okay, dry land and then the plants. The earth brought forth vegetation, plant yielding seed according to their own kind, and trees bearing fruit in their seed, each according to its kind. And the text really implies a much larger biosphere than we have today. Earth today is not primarily luscious vegetation, right? We have a lot of ice caps, deserts, arid environment, Pueblo West. We have a lot of places where it's just not green, yeah? It's not what you imagine when you think the paradise earth that's made to make life easy for us and so much food and opportunity to thrive. Today, we're not living in that environment anymore. But there is some good evidence that the pre-flood world had a significantly larger biosphere. So coal is going to form from buried forests, and in the biblical creation model, this happens during the flood. And so what we can do is we can take basic estimates of how much coal is in the world, the mass of coal, and then equate that back to how much mass in forests and plants would it take to create that much coal. And you actually figure out that if you just convert the coal back into plants, you cover almost the entire land of planet Earth prior to the flood with vegetation. And so the statements that the dry land was covered in vegetation is supported when you just reverse coal back into plants, because that's what it was originally. 4th day of creation, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time here. I had to choose something to narrow down, and this is what I narrowed down. We have the creation of the celestial bodies. You have the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars also. And so that would be sun, moon, and stars created. And it says, let them be for signs and for seasons and days and years. One of the obvious reasons that is stated in the text directly is to give us an ability and a reference point for day, night, right? All those obvious things. Sun comes up, sun goes down. And so it is a calendar tool. I think it is also a tool for us seeing just how powerful and strong God is. Psalm 19, 1-2, very popular passage. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaim his handiwork. Day to day pour out speech, and night to night, and night to night reveal knowledge. And so I think I have people all the time ask, why is the universe so big, though? Yeah, but if you were an infinitely powerful God who could just say the words and it happens, it's not like building a house and the question's, why'd you waste so much money? Why do you want, right? I mean, it's a completely different situation. God expends 0% of his energy. He has an infinite supply of energy. Why wouldn't he make it this large? I mean, if one of the purposes is to display how great he is, why isn't it larger? That's probably the more legitimate question. Why isn't the universe bigger? And there are some answers. The stability of the universe is tied in part to the mass of the universe. And so I think there are some good reasons on why the universe is the size that it is, why God created so many stars. If naturalism is true, though, if you go to the naturalistic theory, there is no God. The universe just comes about naturally. And in their model, everything begins as energy at the point of what is usually called the Big Bang. It turns out the universe should look quite a bit different. It turns out there are a lot of things missing in the universe. And again, I'm going to try to condense 3 classes by just pulling one point out. If everything starts as energy, it turns out there should be what's called not just matter, but antimatter. Now, if antimatter sounds like it's sci-fi, I understand, but it is not just sci-fi. Antimatter has been created in the laboratory for many years now. The Large Hadron Collider, different particle accelerators, you could create antimatter. And really what we find, and this part's undisputed, this is one of the huge problems the Big Bang is still trying to figure out. It's called the baryon number problem. What we're trying to figure out is every time that we create, we convert energy into matter, it produces equal parts matter and antimatter. Every time. 0 exceptions. And again, they won't even argue this. There are 0 exceptions. You get equal parts normal matter, equal parts antimatter. So for every hydrogen, and that's usually what it is, that you convert out of energy using these machines, you get 1 antihydrogen, okay? And instead of an electron, it's a positron. Instead of a proton, well, now I need to remember what it is. I don't know. It's the other one, okay? Anybody here know antimatter? Whew. Yeah. So everything in the naturalist theory comes from energy. All the mass in the universe starts as energy. There's no other way around it. It has to start as energy, and then it converts to matter over time. Oh, antiproton. It's on the screen. Why didn't anybody just say that? I can't see the screen. Antiproton. It's not as cool as positron, right? Positron, antineutrino, or antineutron would be the other one. Not as exciting. Anyways, here's the problem. 2 problems. If everything comes from energy, problem number 1, you should have in the universe equal parts matter and antimatter. Half should be matter, half should be antimatter. But 99.99999% is matter, thankfully. You don't want antimatter floating around, okay? Which leads to point 2. Whenever matter and antimatter interact, they turn back to energy. They explode back into energy. And so if you ever see some antimatter floating around, which couldn't happen because the air is matter, so it would have already reacted, so don't actually go home and worry about this. You imagine everything in the universe is energy, turns into matter, equal parts matter and antimatter, both have gravity and would attract each other gravitationally, which means what should happen to everything? Right back into energy. And once you start spreading out too far, you can't turn back into matter. And so the universe should look very different under a naturalistic framework than what we actually see. 5th and 6th day of creation, I take these together because it's the creation of animal life, okay? Sea life, fowl, animals. It's just animals in general are created on these 2 days. The Bible tells us God designed life. If God designed life, there should be evidence of life being extremely complex, requiring intelligent design, and that's what we're going to find. We found out many years ago scientifically, Louis Pasteur, the law of biogenesis, that living things only come from prior living things. You know what's funny is when I was in high school, it wasn't a good hobby, but I would buy up just random textbooks, science textbooks, because I was trying to learn all this. So I would go through different science textbooks, and I got a zoology textbook, which was super boring in the end. But it's like the third page of the zoology textbook. It says, and I'm not making this up, okay? I have it in storage. So if you're willing to go through my shed to find it, to prove it, you can. It says this: life comes only from prior life through reproduction. Next paragraph. Although we certainly know that life came from non-living material at least once. Same page, not even a different page. Like, you should have put it in a different chapter. It never comes from anything but life, except when it does. And so we've known for a long time you can't get life from non-living material. But they've tried. Oh boy, have they tried. They have quite a few different theories. Now they don't think they've solved this problem. And that's a fair statement. Evolutionists in general, at least academic ones, would not claim this is a solved problem by any stretch of the imagination. Every theory out there has some, well, not just, it has like 4 Achilles heels where it just kind of falls apart. And so some of the ideas, though, like the primordial soup theory, that was like Miller and Urey original experiments on how can we get amino acids in the lab, right? And they get like 3 amino acids in a assortment of toxic stuff that breaks down amino acids, and then it's only one type of amino acid and you need 20. And really, amino acids aren't life. Amino acids are one of the building blocks for life. That's like saying, hey, I got a tree, I got a house. No. I mean, houses are made of wood, and the tree's made of wood, but you gotta like cut it down and then get a lot of them and then build the house. And so this you see headlines though, life created in lab, and it just means we got an amino acid, which is far cry from life. Hydrothermal vent theory, same general principle. They're just locating it specifically on hydrothermal vents, trying to create amino acids in that environment. RNA world, that's the new one. I didn't change it to hypothesis to demean the theory. It's not been promoted to theory yet in even the evolutionary literature because it's really hard. RNA is very unstable. And so to imagine a whole world where RNA just comes about is not a world that actually existed. Clay origins theory, basically all of them have thrown that theory out. It basically said maybe there's like some pre-life that exists that came from clay. Okay, what did that look like? We don't know, but maybe it came from clay. And so they've mostly thrown that theory out. Now, the way you can tell none of these theories work, you know what the dominant theory is today? Anybody know? No? Okay. We'll get there. The reason why these theories are thrown out is because life is just a little too complicated. Little too complicated. There are 2 primary ingredients for life. I don't want to say only 2 ingredients, but 2 primary ingredients. And that would be proteins, which are made from amino acids, and then DNA, which is going to be the coding system for building proteins. That would account for a lot of what life really entails. So when you look at just like a simple prokaryotic bacteria, like a simple cell, the average cell has a couple million proteins. There's about 10 to 20,000, depending on what type of cell, 10 to 20,000 different types of proteins. And those 10 to 20,000 different types of proteins are made by different combinations of 20 amino acids. Okay? So you have 20 different types of amino acids. Those amino acids are in polypeptide chains, typically 300 some in length. And the series of, guanine, adenosine, the series, that's DNA. The series of amino acid determines what type of protein it'll be made into. Okay? Y'all with me? All right. You need all 20 amino acids in order to get life. There's only one recently that they've been able to create in the laboratory. One of the 20, a Japanese group did that like 20 years ago. And you can't get anything with one. There's no protein that's just one amino acid repeated 50 times. So you have a lot of different variety. But it's a little more complicated maybe than than you know, in order to arrange amino acids inside a cell, in order to be made into a protein, okay, you have to connect the amino acids correctly to get the protein that you need in order to accomplish whatever task you're trying to accomplish. And that's DNA's job. DNA's primary job is coding for proteins. It contains the code for how to build these different proteins. So DNA is a 4-base pair code system. So ACTG, which that's something that should be kind of familiar, right? ACTG is the code. And DNA, it's just millions and millions of strands of nucleotides is what they're called. A, C, 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 G, G, C, C, T, T, C, A, T, T, C, T. It just goes on for millions. And what's happening is different sections of that, like it says CCG. That's called a codon when there's 3 of them there. That is specifying, that's coding for a specific amino acid. And then the next, TTA, is coding for another amino acid. And so you take a strand of hundreds to thousands of these DNA nucleotides, you make a copy of it in what's called RNA, and then you send it out to the ribosome, and the ribosome is going to start piecing the different amino acids together based on that code system. Okay? It's, I don't know how much detail. Do you all understand it's complicated? We got there? Okay. This graph was going to tell you about RNA polymerase, which is it is a cellular machine that goes into the nucleus and unwinds the double helix DNA in order to make the RNA copy to send to the ribosome. Okay? And it's got to do its job well, but I'm not going to tell you how it all works. This is the ribosome. Guess what RNA polymerase is made of? Proteins. Guess what ribosomes are made of? Proteins. Everything's made of proteins, which now you have a chicken and egg problem. These make proteins. And they're made of proteins. So which one came first? The ribosome? Or I don't know how to word that correctly, but you get the idea. Ribosomes, what happened, like I said there's a codon. It's a code of 3 different letters. There's a U in there now because it's RNA, so don't worry about that. And these are glycine, lysine. These are amino acids. And so it just reads the code, and these tRNA bring all of these different amino acids, and they attach them and put them on the chains. And then it becomes about 400 long, and then there's another mechanism to fold it into a protein and deliver it where it needs to go. And all of this is supposed to have just happened, which is why they've gone another direction. The dominant theory right now is life started somewhere else in the universe. Maybe Mars. Yeah. Yes, outsourcing. That's what's happening. Why does this help them? Well, maybe something happened on Mars that we don't know about that solves the problem. So it's just trying to push it into mystery. Maybe Mars has some, like what on the periodic table do you think is or isn't on Mars? Like what other element is there that's solving this issue for you? So we try to push it to Mars in order to get it off of our planet. So all that needs to happen, first, life needs to develop on Mars. Again, they have no other element there that's like the magical life element. We know what makes up life. We have it all here. They don't actually have all of it there. They don't have water, but they think maybe at one point in the past they had water, and most people agree life comes about in water. But life's got to start. Big obstacle. That's the obstacle we can't accomplish on Earth yet. But then after that, this is where it gets interesting. An asteroid hits Mars, blows part of the surface of Mars into space. Those pieces have some of the bacteria on them. And those bacteria fly millions of miles through space to Earth. They enter the atmosphere. Somehow they don't burn up in that. So they enter the atmosphere, they survive impact, and now they have a new home. Which sounds a little like a stretch, I think. would be fair. Seems a little unrealistic. There is a group, and like this is in hardcore like evolutionary science groups. There is a group who say, yes, that sounds like a stretch. So maybe there's intelligent life elsewhere in the universe and legit aliens who we don't know where they came from anyways, but set that aside too. Somehow they came about and they just brought life and started seeding life on all the different planets where there's life. And look, I'm willing to say the difference between our theories is I believe God created life, and you believe somewhere in the universe, for some unknown reason and unknown method, aliens appeared, and aliens figured out how to travel here, and for some reason, they put life on planet Earth. I'm willing to concede those are the two positions. I'm not sure how one of them sounds scientific and one of them does not. One of them seems a little bit desperate to me. The Bible tells us animals are created whole, not step by step, and I'm almost done. This gets into an argument called irreducible complexity. Essentially what the Bible is saying, God created original kinds, and while there's variety in those kinds, right, there's a lot of different types of canine types today. Originally, the animals are created whole. God didn't just create a bacteria and say, whoo, we'll let that process work out, and then somehow it goes from bacteria to humans over billions of years. Animals are created whole, not by a random chance process of natural selection and mutation. And so irreducible complexity is the idea that there are systems that you cannot reduce the complexity of without completely removing the function of said item. And biochemist Michael Behe first kind of published this idea in the book Darwin's Black Box. He uses the mousetrap example. I find it amusing that I've read articles from atheists trying to prove why a mousetrap is not irreducibly complex, which is not the point. Okay, the mousetrap is the example, not the actual point. The actual point is life, and I'll give you that. But what Behe says, he says, look, a mousetrap has 5 basic parts to it. You have a platform, you have a catch, you have a holding bar, you have 5 different parts. If you remove the holding bar, let's say you're catching 10 mice a day with all 5 parts. If you remove 1/5 of the parts, the holding bar, how many mice do you catch? 0. Because it's irreducibly complex. You take any of those 5 parts away, and you don't have a mousetrap that works. You go from 10 to 0, no matter what part you remove. And some atheists said, I figured out how to design a mousetrap with 4 parts. That's not the point, okay? The point is this. There are structures inside cells that are irreducibly complex. That the removal of any one part of that structure creates a full cessation of function. And the reason why that A proves creation and B disproves evolution is because the creation model, it makes sense. God creates everything whole, so everything's there at one point to begin with. The evolutionary model, mutation and natural selection over millions of years is supposed to favor beneficial traits, and natural selection should wean out things that are useless and drains on an organism through the basic survival of the fittest kind of natural selection process. And the issue is, if you have a machine that has 5 parts and you have 1 part, it's useless, which means now it's a waste of energy, and natural selection should get rid of it. Even if you make it to 2 parts, it's still useless. It should get rid of it. 3 parts, still useless. Natural selection is a blind mechanism that can't say, well, maybe there'll be 3 more parts. Natural selection is a description of what happens, that those who are inferior tend to die off in the population. And so what we figured out is that there are organisms that have irreducible complex systems, and Darwin even said this was one of the things that would disprove his theory. He said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find no such case. Now, that was before we had a microscope. And it turns out that even if you can't find that case on the large scale, 200 years ago. You can find it on the microscopic scale now today. I'll just give you the easy example because we already talked about them, and that would be the ribosome. So the ribosome is irreducibly complex. The simplest possible ribosome has 56 parts. You need every part for any function. And so the question is, how do you build a ribosome? You think you're getting 56 unique mutations to create a whole machine randomly? You need small steps over time, but natural selection, every time something's useless, should weed that out. And so it works with creation, it doesn't work with evolution. You don't randomly get life. Life takes intentional design in order to come about, in order to exist. And so the question is simply, which worldview best explains the evidence? And while this was certainly a condensed version of presenting the topic, and there's a lot more to say about the problems with the other side and more reasons why I think biblical creation is true, hopefully this is a good overview on some of the ideas of how you go through Genesis chapter 1, and you can see verification for what the Bible says about the different days of creation and how it is against the modern secular naturalist origin theories that are often taught to children in schools and at university and everywhere else you go. And so hopefully you are a little more prepared and a little more equipped and a little more grounded in the truth of what the Bible says. And with that, I only went 5 minutes over time because we started 9 minutes late. I only went 5 minutes over time, and I will stop the presentation and we can move into Q&A for anybody who would like to ask questions. You have the mic? Or are you texting me? Oh, okay. That means there's online questions. Uh-oh. Oh, with a lot of faces, huh? Okay. Mm-hmm. Does anyone here have a question? Have a good night. I'll wait a second at least. One person asks, wouldn't God have the power to do as he wants? Yes. Not sure where this is going, Mason. The question is not, could God have done things another way? The question is simply, how did God say he did it? And then how do we verify and support that statement? How can life evolve in water when water is a solvent and wouldn't dissolve any chemical bonds? I'm not defending evolution, guys. I do think that the origins of life is a huge problem. Mason, are there any real questions on here? He thinks all the coal in the earth equals covering the earth with plants. Yeah, it's really not that hard to do a conversion of mass from coal back to forests, and the evolutionists have actually done all the work on actually doing estimates on the amount of coal that's in the world, and so you can do a conversion of the mass of a forest for a certain area and convert it from coal. So yes. In overpopulation areas, there is a big issue of breathing problems. Ecological system is going to be destroyed due to human interference for the sake of commercial activities. Yeah, and it doesn't sound like this is so much the global warming aspect as it is just basic air pollution, because I know this individual, they live in another country actually where this probably is a serious problem. So I do think that would be correct in some cases and in some places. I tend to be against a lot of the large-scale environmentalist movements, but I'm for some of the common sense, you shouldn't pump toxins into the air around everybody. That seems dumb. You shouldn't put a bunch of poison into the water. That seems dumb. And so there are some places in the world where there are not regulations, at least heavy regulations on those things, and so there are a lot of health problems in those areas, and we should be good stewards of the earth and taking care of where we live, not just for our sakes, but we should be thinking generationally. Even if you think the Lord's going to come back and the world's going to end tomorrow, you should at least act and plan as if you will have great-great-great-great grandkids, and they need somewhere to live, and you shouldn't ruin the whole place for them. Now, again, this is not a comment on global warming. This is more of a comment on basic, should we burn plastic all over town to get rid of it? Probably not, okay? All right. Are there any other ones?
There's 2 more on
Okay.
Facebook, but we don't. One person asks, where do dinosaurs fit?
Day 6 and
There you go.
5, I guess, if you count the water ones. Yeah, I think dinosaurs are created in the creation account, so I think they're created in the week of creation on day 5 for water and fowl-based, like air-based dinosaurs, and then day 6 for the land-based ones. I think they lived in the world, and I think they went on the ark, and then I think they couldn't adapt, and they have died out. The vast majority die in the flood, though, which is the case for any organism. Next question. I don't know how to ask this one. Okay. Any questions in the room? Here. Mason.
I'll send you the one that's on Facebook.
Okay.
But
You might have to change the camera. I'm going to sit down now.
I already planned for that. Where's the question?
Mike, back here.
Sorry about that.
You know, I always got to ask you something. Let's talk about decay for a minute. We look back at, 6,000 years ago, they're pulling these ice tests out of the Antarctica, and they're finding out we had more oxygen. And then we look at the Bible, and we find out that people were taller and they lived longer. And then we kind of decayed down to, back to the late 1800s. I was taking tours of plantations down south, and all the beds were smaller, the clothes were smaller. We kind of shrunk, and now we're getting taller again, and we're living longer. I do not believe that this is part of an evolutionary theory, but I do think that there's truth to the fact that we used to live longer and we had maybe more oxygen back then. Is there, can you talk to that?
Yeah. The environmental changes, ice cores give a little bit, but amber, so fossilized tree sap and the air bubbles inside the fossilized tree sap would be pre-flood air. And so that air is slightly higher in oxygen levels. You don't want massively higher oxygen levels because then it sounds like a weird statement, but forest fires become completely uncontrollable. And you literally start burning the whole world up if you put too much oxygen in the system. But I think it's like 15% higher in amber. And having a little more oxygen would be helpful for our health. I do think people lived as long as Genesis chapter 5 says that they were living. I think the main reason for that, and I have like 2 presentations on this. The main reason for that is genetic, I think. So what happens is the reason you can't live forever is not because you don't take care of yourself, it's because your genes program you to die. And so we've done a lot of testing. This was Leonard Hayflick, I think was the guy who did this. It's called the Hayflick limit. And so cells in a protected environment in the laboratory with everything they need, blocked from all radiation, given ideal circumstances, die after so many generations, usually like 60 to 80 divisions, it just dies. It can't divide anymore. The cell stops existing. So the primary reason your cells have something called telomeres on them. And so just picture like a bead necklace. Let's say it has 80 beads on it. And every time your cell divides, part of the DNA replication process, which I didn't talk about tonight, has to attach to the end bead and clip it off. And eventually, you've clipped all the beads off, and you can't divide anymore, and organs start to go into failure. The way you change that is through reversing mutation. So Adam and Eve originally are created with a perfect genome and the ability genetically to live much longer, and then over time, especially around and after the flood, mutation starts building up. There's a lot of different reasons why that would happen, including the Earth's magnetic field getting significantly weaker because of the flood situation. You have genetics tanking at that point, and that starts to cut the lifespans down. The one very interesting inference that you might be able to make, there are a lot of mutations that skip a generation. Okay, there's a lot of diseases that skip a generation, which is why when you go to the doctor, they don't just ask you about your parents, they ask you about your grandparents. Because there are several things your grandparents can have that will skip your parents and then hit you. If you look at the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5, the 10 generations from Adam to Noah, everybody's in the 900s with one exception. Well, with two exceptions, but only one that counts. Enoch is not, but he walks with God and is no more, so that's a whole different situation. Out of the people who naturally die, there's only one person who doesn't make 900. He doesn't even make 800. He dies in his 700s, significantly earlier, 200 years earlier than average, and that is Noah's father, Lamech. And what we see is it goes like this: Lamech dips, Noah goes back up, all of Noah's sons dip. And then it starts falling from there. And so I can't prove that's what it's linked to, but it's an interesting possibility. Lamech gets hit with the mutation, skips Noah, hits all three sons. They're now the genetic procreators of the entire world, though, because everybody comes from Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And so then you have a decline, a gradual decline over about 900 years in ages. It takes a while. It takes a series of mutations. That would just be the first one. Abraham's living long, 200 some years. I mean, they're living long still at the time of Abraham. Moses lives 120 years, and it doesn't act like it's abnormal. And then eventually you kind of level out, and the average age, not from being like shot, okay, but the average old age is 70 to 80. The reason we're living longer today is exclusively medical intervention. That is the only reason we're living longer today. And evolutionists actually tend to agree with that. They don't think it's evolution and we're improving, because in evolutionary theory, your improvements take place over hundreds of thousands of years. You wouldn't notice in 20 years actual evolution taking place in their theory. And so it's medical intervention and then increased access to nutrition is why people grow bigger than some other people in developed countries. And then medical intervention, which I like, right? Don't get me wrong, I'd be dead without medical intervention. You'd be dead without medical intervention. So it's a good thing, but it's not evolution. It's just we got good at medical stuff. Yeah. Other questions? Did you text me?
No, there's one more though.
Okay.
Online.
So Quinn, what is your belief or stance on creation being over 6,000 years of earth time compared to 1 day of heaven's time, when it compares the 1 day to 1,000 earthly years?
Yeah, the comment in Peter is related to the statement simply saying God's outside of time is the idea. It's essentially saying, don't think that God got lazy and isn't coming back to deal with everything. Time is just different. He's outside of time. A day to him is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. It then does the reverse method of that statement in the same verse. What I think is that on day one, we have the creation of Earth, and a day is defined by Earth. It's just Earth's rotation around its axis. And so from the very first verse of the Bible, the objective standard for normal day is in place. And so I tend to just see it as days, normal days. I mean, we could go, if you have a specific argument, like there's the day-age theory, which says they're all long periods of time, but they don't say they're thousands of years. This is an attempt to get billions of years into the system. I don't think that's doable grammatically. I don't think that's what the Hebrew means. I think God talks to us in ways that are clear to us. And so if God's revealing to Moses on Mount Sinai that I created in 6 days, I think he's using Moses' language, and it's 6 days. I would have to see a strong argument for anything outside of normal days. Now, I do think the days were probably 22 hours, but that's a whole nother topic that somebody would have to raise their hand and ask the question for me to want to go into. Other questions?
There was one more in reference
Okay.
to dinosaurs, if you want.
Okay. Did you send it to me?
No, I didn't. I'm just going to read it. In reference to dinosaurs, it says, if they couldn't adapt, could that be considered natural selection?
Yeah, I mean, natural selection is real. Natural selection is just survival of the fittest. Whoever survives best tends to be the ones who reproduce and tend to be the ones who pass on their genetics. And so, yeah, if you can't survive, you die. If you die before you have kids, you don't have kids. If you don't have kids, you go extinct. So yes, that's just basic natural selection. Natural selection isn't an evolutionary idea. It's a description of how things work in reality, and they're just trying to apply it to very long periods of time and say that you can get massive changes if you give it enough time alongside mutation. Yeah, certainly happens. It happens in homes too with siblings. Yeah, survival of the fittest is a real thing. Any other questions?
There's one more on YouTube.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on the James Webb Telescope?
Cool. It's significantly better than Hubble. It's fun to look at some of the comparisons between the two. Like you have the Horse Nebula, that's like a really popular one, and you could see just the clarity of Webb versus Hubble. And so I like it. I'm glad. Well, I don't know if I'm glad they spent our tax money on it, but I think it's really cool to see the images of space. I think that goes towards magnifying our perception of God and his design and power in creation. So I don't mind it. They found some really cool things. They found some really neat black hole images. Well, they find the accretion disk of the black hole, and then they have the black spot in the center. So I think it's fun. I don't know what else I'm supposed to say. It's the best telescope in existence right now, so I think it's good. Yeah, it does its job well. Yeah, I think it is up there. Maybe I should go back there. I do think James Webb Space Telescope is indeed flying in space right now because there's not a dome in the way. Yeah. It can be up there because the Earth's not flat. Right here? Raise your hand one more time.
Down.
What about carbon dating versus the creation?
Yeah, so carbon dating is one of the radioactive dating methods. It is used to establish ages typically under 90,000 years. Usually you're in like rubidium, strontium, lead, potassium, argon, when you're dealing with the millions and billions of year-old ages. But some of the principles of issues would apply to all of them equally. Carbon dating, the way carbon dating works is you find a dead carbon-based object, so a plant or an animal, right? Some carbon-based life form. And you're looking for what is the percentage of carbon-12, which is standard carbon, which is almost all that you're made of, well, in water. What's the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14, radioactive carbon-14? So what happens is when you're alive, you eat food, and if you don't, you're dead, right? So when you're alive, you eat food, and when you're eating food, you are in balance with the atmosphere's ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 because plants, through photosynthesis, are bringing in the ratio from the atmosphere that is there of carbon-12 to carbon-14. So as long as you're eating, your body stays in balance. So if it's 10 parts per million, that's not the real number, if it's 10 parts per million carbon-14 in the atmosphere, while we're alive eating food, our bodies are 10 parts per million carbon-14. When you die, the carbon-12 stays, the carbon-14 starts to go away, and it goes away at a half-life. So if there's 10 grams, after one half-life, there'll be 5 grams, and the half-life is 5,780 years, if memory serves. 5,780 years, somewhere around there, is the half-life of carbon-14. So what they do is they find an object on the ground, it's dead, or it's, a plant or something, and they say, hey, look, that object is, hang on, let me do this in my head real quick, 1.25 parts per million carbon-14. And the atmosphere is 10, which means 10 divided by 2 is 5, divided by 2 is 2.5, divided by 2 is 1.25. 3 half-lives of decay has taken place. Add up the half-life, right? Take the half-life times 3, and you end up with roughly 17,000 years old. Okay? That's how they reach their number. The problem with carbon-14 has been, but what was the atmosphere like when it died? That's the question. Because if the atmosphere is going up in the amount of carbon-14 it has, then anything dead is going to look significantly older than it really was. Because if it has 1.25 now and our atmosphere has 10, but when it died the atmosphere had 2.5, that means it's only one half-life, and the atmosphere just went up over that one half-life. And instead of 1, we just calculated 3, and we tripled the age. So their response, we're going to unpack this. Their response is, but we can go back and we can look through tree ring dating, dendrochronology, and sometimes through ice cores, but usually it's tree rings is the main way we do this. We can go back and we can look at what the level of carbon-14 was in the atmosphere at different points, because the tree rings record annual atmosphere percents of carbon-14 compared to carbon-12, all right? Which is correct. You can do that up to 3,500 years ago, and then you lose the collaboration source. Which is why, if you listen to some of my presentations, I will say we carbon dated the ushery of James, the brother of Jesus, its 1st century, to support that we actually found the bone box remains of James, the brother of Jesus. And the reason why I'm comfortable saying we carbon dated it's correct is because it's 2,000 years ago, we can actually verify the level of carbon-14 in the atmosphere 2,000 years ago. The problem is when the flood is 4,400 years ago, and what we're dealing with is a lot of post-flood material, and what happens during the flood is a drastic reduction in the magnetic field strength, which would amplify tremendously the production of carbon-14, so everything that is before the flood would look astronomically older than it is because it has so little carbon-14 in the atmosphere. We're taking pre-flood world that we can't go that far back and verify, and we're just assuming it matches some other number, and then we're throwing up huge ages. And so this actually was, you can use this in reverse. There was a group back in 2014, 15, they claimed they found Noah's Ark. It was a Chinese research group, claimed they found Noah's Ark, and they said they carbon dated the wood, and it was 4,500 years old. But if that was pre-flood wood, it should have said 40 to 50,000 years old. And so it actually ended up shooting the theory down because any wood from before the flood should look astronomically older because we're using a different atmosphere to try to calibrate the system. Carbon-14 has actually become a very nice friend of creationists. We find carbon-14 in all sorts of stuff that shouldn't have carbon-14. So for example, we have diamonds. Diamonds are carbon-based, right? They're the hardest carbon-based material on Earth. They're supposed to be 1 billion years old, hundreds of millions to 1 billion years old. And some creationist created some shell corporations, because nobody will do tests for creationists in evolutionary labs, so they have to create all these organizations to trick them into thinking they're evolutionists as well, and they need these tests done. Anyway, so an evolutionary lab did the testing. It's super expensive because you have to buy diamonds and then pay the lab hundreds of thousands of dollars to do these tests. But Institute for Creation Research paid for it with the RAPE project. This was one of the studies they did. What they figured out is diamonds, ancient diamonds, all the ones tested have carbon-14 in them, which shouldn't be possible because carbon-14 with such a short half-life, after about 100,000 years, it's undetectable. It should all be gone. And so the fact that every carbon-based life form or item, diamonds, coal, oil, those are or originate as carbon-based elements, they all have carbon-14 still in them. They're supposed to be millions of years old. There should be no more carbon-14 in any of these things. And so the RAPE project did a really good job of flipping this topic, and it actually ends up being pretty good evidence that the Earth is not that old. And then it actually, one interesting study took all of the coal beds, not all the coal beds, it took several coal beds, but all the coal beds that they tested, they all give an age that is relatively the same. Now it's pre-flood world, which means the ages will look high, but when all the coal beds say 44,000 years and have the same amount of carbon-14, what would the implication be? They all form at the same time because they're all decaying with the exact same levels today, which is actually now a reverse argument that all the coal had to form at the same time, which a secular model can't pull off. You need a flood now in order to do that. The flood would create them all at the same time. So there's some problems with carbon-14 being used for old ages. But it actually ends up helping us quite a bit now. Yeah, I almost actually put that in the presentation today, but I was at 80 slides, and I thought I should probably stop. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Well, wait for the mic just for the people online, or they can't hear you. Mic. Yeah, that worked.
Mike, Navy Mike.
Mike need mic.
So the dinosaur problem seems to be a big issue for people, and I know that my kids and grandkids, same thing. And I would say that, if we look at the dinosaurs that came off of the Ark, which would be the only living dinosaurs that anybody would ever know of or to carve onto a rock somewhere, were not called dinosaurs until the 1800s is when we started that. So they were called dragons, and we had droves of dragon slayers roaming the earth. Would you think that, well, in your opinion, maybe that the dinosaurs were forcefully extinct or driven to extinction because of they were killed off by, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I think when you come off the ark and God then gives you the command, you can eat animals, okay? I don't think this is the only reason, but I think it's one of several reasons that just result in what we see today. Before the flood, they're told not to eat the animals. That's not part of their diet. After the flood, the earth was just like cleaned up. There's no forests yet. They have to regrow everything. They're extremely scarce on food. You need a food source. God says, you can eat animals now, okay? Which I'm sure a lot of you are happy about. And so you got to start somewhere. And I think it's funny that if they had started with cats, we would be having this conversation about cats. I can't prove they ate the dinosaurs. There's a lot of extinct organisms today, but it is a valid potential that out of there are multiple kinds of dinosaurs. It's not just one kind of dinosaur. And I don't know the exact number. There's a branch of study called baraminology, which is a study of created kinds, and they have some people who've done this with their life, which is good for them. It's very useful for us. AIG, ICR, CMI all have groups that are actually narrowing down all of the original kinds to figure out how many there are. Anyways, so there's probably 50 to 100 dinosaurs that exist at this time. Couple factors. One, you got to eat something. So I do think that could be an answer for several of them. Number two, I do think they struggle with the environment at that point. And you brought it up earlier, the oxygen issue, I think may specifically hit some of the larger dinosaurs harder when there's a decrease in oxygen. Number three, the world's extremely hard to live in right after the flood. There's a lot of residual effects. There are massive, what are called hypercanes, so like hurricanes except like 10 times bigger, that are pounding the earth still because of the effects of the flood. You have an ice age start soon after. There's enormous amount of earthquake activity at this time because of the plate tectonic movement during the flood. It could be as simple as those 4 kinds of dinosaurs died in an earthquake randomly. And people say, why just the dinosaurs? It's not just the dinosaurs. Most things that have lived are extinct. Most kinds of animals are extinct. And so it doesn't mean they didn't go on the ark, it just means they couldn't adapt afterwards, and that's why so many kinds go away. Dinosaurs, all being similar to each other, have probably similar struggles to adapt to the world and die off. But yeah, I think diets is a potential. Yeah, I do agree. We called them dragons historically. That's one of the hardest parts for evolution. Is like Richard Dawkins was asked years ago, how would you disprove evolution? He said, find a dinosaur, right? It doesn't count though that we can find 500 years ago people literally drawing dinosaurs all over the place before we ever dug up a fossil in the 1840 time frame. He really wouldn't change because there are several other organisms that's supposed to be extinct at the same time or prior to dinosaurs that we did find today, like coelacanths, the Wollemi pine. We found several ancient extinct organisms today, and they say what? Wow, it survived that long with no evolution. For 90 million years, it didn't change. So I don't think it would actually convince them. But it would be great if you could find a dinosaur. It would really jack up that theory. They would really struggle if you found a dinosaur. I don't think they'd abandon the theory. I think they'd just say, man, how did that thing survive for 65 million years? And they'd just kind of completely miss the point. And the main reason you miss the point is why? You don't want the alternative. That's the reason most people will just miss the point. That's why we're comfortable saying aliens brought life, because we don't want the alternative, because aliens don't have a moral code that you have to follow. And if that was offensive, to anybody, I think that's biblical, right? Romans 1, suppress the truth in unrighteousness, deny God as creator. I mean, that's biblical. All right, other questions? Did you text me anymore, or did I get them all?
No, you got them all. I haven't sent. Well,
Good.
15 minutes ago. You kind of.
How old do you think the Earth is and why?
Yeah.
I didn't get them all.
Yeah, I was going to say you kind of answered that.
Okay, this will be the last one. How old do you think the Earth is and why? I think the Earth specifically, is 6,000 to 7,000 years old. Why? I think you just add up chronologies in the Bible. That's the easy answer. If you want to study some more, I'll give you a few pieces of evidence that you can unpack that I'm not going to fully unpack. Number one is actually the magnetic field theory. Humphrey's theory predicts everything in the solar system based on the assumption it's 6,000 years old. And so that would be evidence that it's 6,000 years old because that's the only date you can take, the only age you can take, and accurately blindly predict everything. Second, helium diffusion in zircon crystals. You could look that up if you want. The RATE project, which is radioactive isotopes and the age of the Earth is what it stands for. RATE. You can look that project up. They give several lines of evidence. Yeah, we'll just stick with that. I do think the universe could be significantly older, though. And again, I told you you could ask about that if you wanted. Nobody asked about it, so I'm not going to develop it. But look up White Hole Cosmology by Russell Humphreys, planetary magnetism guy, or Cosmological Special Relativity by John Hartnett. And those are some interesting theories that use Einstein's time dilation theory to explain a lot of things. So, all right, no other questions in the room. Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope that was at least boost of your faith and confidence in what the Bible says. There will be a test on your way out on all of the information. Thank you guys for coming.